Okay, today I want to refresh your memory about what we have talked about this last month. And then on Wednesday we'll have our midterm exam. All you need to do on Wednesday is to bring a pencil and your student number. You don't need a blue book or a Scantron or anything like that, just a pencil and the student number. And I'll bring the Scantron and the question sheets. There'll be 50 questions, multiple choice questions, and they all come from here. So if you have memorized all of this material, you are looking at the answers on the exam, so no problems. So let me go over this material then and refresh your memory a little bit. Chapter 22 talked about the rise of royal absolutism. And the key word there is absolutism, absolutist. The monarchs believed that they had a divine right of kings, the divine right to rule, they were divine kings, the divine right of kings, that they had been given by God the right to rule. So therefore they did not need a parliament, they did not need approval from anybody to rule. So it wasn't a democracy, it wasn't fascism, it wasn't communism or socialism, it was absolutism. And the Bourbon dynasty ruled in France, and the Bourbon dynasty has dominated France for many centuries. And this absolutist idea that the king had a divine right to rule is epitomized most famously by Louis XIV, in which he used to go around saying, "L'État, c'est moi, l'État, c'est moi." The state, it is me. I am the state. I am France. I am the system. L'État, c'est moi. The state, it is me. And that epitomized that whole ideology, that whole system of government that European kings followed, the absolutist model, which of course Democrats had to fight against to try to introduce a constitutional government, and it was the people that should have the voice in the government. In Austria, it was the Habsburg dynasty. The Habsburg dynasty lasted until 1918, when it was abolished. So the Bourbon dynasty in France and the Habsburg dynasty in Austria, and they fought each other for centuries, for several centuries, as to who was the dominant family, the dominant power in all of Europe, the Bourbon versus the Habsburg. In Germany, of course, which has come to dominate our modern history, especially since it was created in 1871, is of course dominated by the state of Prussia. Dominated by the state of Prussia on East Germany. And the big question in history was, who was going to unite all of the German-speaking peoples? Was it going to be Prussia, or was it going to be Austria-Hungary? Was it going to be the Habsburg dynasty? And in the end, of course, we know that it was the Prussians that dominated all over Europe. And Prussian society was very conservative. It was very militaristic. It was very conservative. And because Prussia was dominated, Prussia dominated all of the German-speaking peoples, then the German-speaking peoples, modern Germany, after 1871, was characterized by the personality of Prussia, which was very conservative, very, very militaristic. Hence, our history since 1871 has been a militaristic kind of history. And the aristocracy was the Junker aristocracy, J-U-N-C-K-E-R, pronounced Junker. And it was this Junker aristocracy which dominated Prussia. And these Junkers were large farm owners, large landowners, many of them went to university, many of them took up fencing, because that was the ethos, the cultural ethos. It was to be militaristic, to be a soldier, to be fighting. And that's what Prussia was renowned for. As a result, they had the barracks mentality, the Junker aristocracy. In art of the 18th century, when we look at Versailles in Paris, when we look at the Vatican City, when we look at many of the churches of Italy, when we look at, you go to Austria, you go to many of the palaces, you go to many of the churches, you go to the opera theatre, then you will look at the Baroque style, the Baroque style. And it was the Baroque style of the 18th century that was the style of the age. It was very, very ornate, and it was grandiose, and of course, in some ways it was replaced by neoclassicism. Neoclassicism, of course, go back to Greece and Rome. And particularly at the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, neoclassicism became very, very popular, which is why, for example, what have we got? Pierce Hall out here on campus with the columns, that is neoclassical style. U of M founded in 1817, wasn't it? They, on State Street, neoclassical styles. You see some of the buildings. Lansing, neoclassical. The White House with the white columns in front of it, neoclassical style. That replaced the Baroque. So Baroque and classicism or neoclassicism. Chapter 23 talks about Western society in the New World. And European civilization came to the New World. And of course, Spanish were the first. Portuguese followed very, very closely, or pretty much at the same time. And when the Spanish came here, of course, the whites came over, and they were known as peninsulars. And it was these whites, these peninsulars, that dominated Latin American society. They were whites, they went back to Spain to find wives, and they had children, and their children were sent back to Spain to be educated. And these were the dominant people that governed in Mexico and Peru and other kinds of peninsulas. Other groups of people were the Creoles, that were the mixed races, the Indians. Eventually, in time, it was the mestizos, the children of the whites and American Indians that dominated Indian society. But obviously, the ruling classes were the peninsulars. In North America, of course, our history up here, the business people, of course, from Europe hoped to make a lot of money from North America. But of course, at that time, there was no industrialization, there was no coal mines, there was no oil wells at that particular time. And as a result of that, a dominant part of the economy became settlers and rents. So the settlers, and so the European businessmen then tried to make money by shipping people out to North America, by the shipping cost and by renting out houses here in the New World. And this led in time to new landowning patterns and squatters' rights. So it created a new society. Obviously, when the Europeans founded some of the companies that came out, to the Virginia Company, for example, and the Plymouth colony, etc., when all of these colonies and companies were founded to populate North America, they expected to replicate European society. They expected that they would copy the class system of England, would copy the aristocracy domination. But of course, North America is very, very big. A population was very, very small at that time. And as a result of that, ordinary people, working class people, had more freedoms. They had more opportunity. If they didn't like their landowner, if they didn't like paying rent to them, they could run away, because America was such a big And that created a new society, a much more dynamic society than Europe, a much more open society than Europe, a society that is less dominated by classes and was more egalitarian. And it was this kind of openness in society. And as a result of that, the landowning patterns and squatters got more rights. They began to think of themselves as more free, and as a result of this, this created a more egalitarian, a more dynamic society. And of course, once the West was opened up, we developed this idea of manifest destiny and a greater sense of equality. So all history, as I mentioned before, is one of two things. It is ideology or it is material factors. Material factors means the economy. And it was the economy that was driving this. Now, all societies, all stable societies, have a dominant ethnic group. In the case of England, of course, that was the English, much to the regret of the Welsh, the Scottish, and the Irish, but it was the English. In France, it has always been the northern French that have dominated. In Spain, it is the northern Spanish that have dominated. In Italy, it is the northern Italians. If you have a stable society, then you almost always have a dominant ethnic group. And when you look around the world today, for example, as we speak, there's more or less a civil war going on in Libya. Why? Because two ethnic groups, one in the east, one in the north, are fighting against each other. In Kenya, there's the same situation going on. Places like Liberia and Sierra Leone, similar kind of situations. To have a stable society, usually most these countries are dominated by one ethnic group. And in our case, though, the problem was, as in the case of Canada, in the case of New Zealand, whenever you have a settler society, you do not have an inbuilt dominant ethnic group. Obviously, when we first came, the dominant ethnic group was the American Indians, but we simply shoved them aside and stepped in and dominated the society. So over time, we have developed what is known as the WASP, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant dominated. But of course, more correctly, it is the Celtic, Anglos and Teutonics that have created the elite of our society. Celtics, of course, being the Irish, Scottish and Welsh, but mostly the Irish. The Anglos, of course, being the English, and the Teutonics. Teutonics meaning Germanic peoples. And the Germanic, the Germans, and amongst the Germanic you can include the Germans, the Dutch, and you can also include to a certain extent the Scandinavians. And these three groups created the melting pot, and this was the ethnicity, the cats, the Celtic Anglo-Teutonic that made up our Anglo society, and that dominates our religious values, our societal values, etc. And we have shoved aside American Indians. We never gave the African Americans any power, any rights in our society, nor the Asians on the Pacific coast. They were not part of our mainstream. It is the Celtics, Anglos and Teutonics, the cats, that had created the mainstream of America. Being challenged now, of course, by Hispanics, by Asian Americans, but this is the dominant ethnicity and all new countries like Canada, like Australia, like New Zealand, have to create a dominant group, a mainstream ethnicity, a mainstream culture, if you like. And that's what happened with us. Ours was made up of these three groups. in spite of the fact that in the 19th century, the overwhelming majority on the West Coast were Hispanics. And in California today, the overwhelming, not the overwhelming majority, but an increasingly large number of Hispanics are Asian. And the largest ethnicity, the largest group in California are from the Philippines, of all places. You have large numbers of Chinese, large numbers of Japanese, for example, large numbers of Hispanics moving in, but still the dominant ethos, the dominant culture is the Cats. And what also contributed to the dynamism of America, in addition to the land-owning patterns and the settler rights, is of course the decentralized government. The decentralized government. When you look at England, England is tightly governed from London. France was tightly governed from Paris. Spain was tightly governed from Madrid. Italy was a different case. It was not until after 1871 that Italy would be tightly governed from Rome. But a characteristic of our society was a lot of decentralization, that we had a balance of power, and this gave the regions, at first, of course, the South and the West, which in those days, of course, was the Ohio Valley, that was the West. But later on, as we moved in the 19th century further west, a great deal of independence, a great deal of society, a large number of opportunities, etc. And that is what has made our society much more dynamic and much more open than the European societies. Chapter 24 talks about the age of reason. The age of reason in the 19th century. And of course, this was a major breakthrough in world intellectual history. Prior to the 18th century, almost all civilizations look back to their ancient sources of wisdom, their ancient authorities. In the West, of course, it was the Bible. Christianity always looked back to the Bible, whether the Old Testament or the New Testament, but until the 18th century, the source of all knowledge was the Bible. And all knowledge began with the Bible. In the Muslim world, people look back to the Quran, to the Holy Quran. And that was the source of knowledge, and all knowledge came from that. In China, they all look back to 500 years before Christ, to Confucius. Confucius was the basics of their civilization, the basis of their knowledge. In India, it was the Vedas, V-E-D-A, that was the holy book. And so whenever you wanted to study anything intellectual or to understand something, you went back to these ancient sources. And in Europe, as I said, this was the case. You looked to the Bible. And even how do you explain the way the world works? Well, obviously, God created the world. The world, therefore, is the center of God's universe. Therefore, Earth is the center of the universe. And that's what you found in the religious texts for that reasoning. So everything was biblical-centered and God-centered and Christianity-centered. And the 18th century broke that tradition. Instead of following their own book, truth came not from the ancient books. Truth came not from the Bible. You could not explain everything from the Bible. Instead, you could explain everything through the scientific method. Observation, study, measurement, analysis, logical reasoning, logical thought. And this is known as empiricism. And so what happened in Western society was that Western society became open to new ideas. It became open to new science, and so new science, new knowledge began to be accepted. They did not yet give up religious feeling, although that for many people that came later. But of course, in the 15th and the 16th centuries, the Pope tried to stop all new knowledge, which is why they put Galileo on trial, for example, when he said that si muove, that the planetary system moves. And the Pope said, no, God created it, doesn't move. And Galileo said it did. It was against a religious dogma. So that's why he was put on trial. 2 centuries later, however, the Europeans began to accept that there was scientific knowledge. With telescopes, they could find the truth. You didn't find it in the Bible. The scientific method. And so it became possible in Europe to accept that there was a new body of truth, a new body of understanding, and that this body of understanding, this truth, was not heretical. It was not anti-religious. It was not anti-Christian to think that there is such a thing as gravity, for example. And so this whole body of scientific knowledge began to be accepted into the Western tradition, alongside the Bible, alongside religious feelings. And that's why the world, since Columbus, has been dominated by the West, because we accepted science and scientific knowledge. And other civilizations fell behind. The Chinese fell behind, the Indians fell behind, the Muslim civilization all fell behind, because they did not accept this new scientific tradition, this new reality. And empiricism, you need to remember that word. Enlightenment or empiricism. And of course, René Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Cogito, he said it in Latin, cogito ergo sum. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And we don't understand how revolutionary that is. But truth can come from your own thoughts, from your own logic. And that is not what other cultures accepted. That is not what other traditions accepted. But the Europeans did. And we did. And hence the importance of it. And this whole new way of thinking, this Enlightenment period, the empiricism, was most famous in France because of the philosophers, the philosophes, and of the philosophes, Voltaire was the most famous of them all. Voltaire, René Voltaire, and he was the most famous of them at all. And of course, this was not only a challenge to biblical knowledge, not only a challenge to religious knowledge, but it was also a challenge to political philosophy, a challenge to absolutism. And Rousseau said, man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. Man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. So it is a democratic movement, an intellectually democratic movement. And this was represented by Denis in our language, double N, in French, Denis Diderot. And it was he who came up with the idea of the encyclopedia. And this was revolutionary in the 18th century because the encyclopedia was organized alphabetically, A, B, C, D, E. It did not put the Bible at the beginning. It did not put the Pope at the beginning. It did not put the kings at the beginning. All were democratic. all knowledge is democratic. Simply A, B, C, D, E, where it is in the alphabet. And this was revolutionary in the 18th century. It ushers in a new democratic idea, democratic knowledge. And in England in 1660, they created the Royal Society. The Royal Society. And again, this was revolutionary because it was sponsored by the king, but it was a society of intellectuals, and in which they met in this big hall, and anyone who had a new scientific paper to read would read out the paper, and people would discuss it. And this brought in new ideas, new revolutionary ideas that challenged the king, that challenged the Pope, that challenged religion, but it was the spirit of a European Western civilization, the scientific and the opening up of the minds. And again, this is revolutionary when you compare it to other societies. You compare it to India, to China, to Japan, to the Muslim societies, for example, that they tried, some of them tried to keep up. The Ottomans, for example, tried to modernize, but there were too many religious folks who said, stop, all you need is the holy books and our tradition. And likewise in China. It was not until 1912 in China that they got rid of the Confucian books and began to accept modern scientific knowledge. By then it was too late. The Europeans and Western civilization had gone too far ahead and dominated the rest of the world because of their science and technology, the power of their guns, the power of their soldiers, etc. So the Royal Society was an important part of that movement. And in art, of course, after Neoclassicism, we had very, very ornate styles. Rococo, Portuguese word. In music, of course, the 18th century was a magnificent period of Baroque music, Bach, up in Germany. Most of them were Germans. Handel, Haydn, Mozart, all of them were Germans. And it's interesting how some cultures produce some great periods of art. The 20th century, of course, has been modern art, and the 20th century, of course, it is New York that has perhaps contributed most to 20th century modern art. In music, of course, if you love classical music, then essentially you are a German. You're all Germans, because whether it is Haydn or Bach or Mozart or Beethoven or Wagner, it is all German. If you love food, of course, then you have to be a Frenchman. It is the French who, for some peculiar reason, have produced some of the best food in all over Europe. Don't go to England expecting very good food. You don't get it. It's not as good as the French. However, what England has produced, perhaps more greater than any other European country, of course, is literature. From Shakespeare to Dickens, to all of those novelists of the 19th century, to the poets of the earlier part of the 18th century, Byron, Shelley, Keats, Wordsworth. England has always had this remarkable ability to produce great literature. Not great food, not great music compared to Germany, but certainly great literature. Why some cultures produce some things than others? It's a question of tradition, and it's a question of heritage, for example. But in music, if you are 18th century, then of course Bach, Handel, Haydn, and Mozart. The next chapter talked about the coming of constitutionalism. And of course, in this, the United States played an enormous role with the Declaration of Independence of 1776, the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Talks about an individual pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And this came from the glorious revolution of Great Britain, the glorious revolution of 1688, which inspired 1776, which then in turn inspired the French Revolution of 1789. These were all democratic movements aimed at challenging absolutist governments, absolutist monarchy, and the spirit of it was a democratic spirit. And it was led also in the Netherlands, in Holland, the House of Orange. The House of Orange. And the Dutch were one of the first to develop a real democratic system. This House of Orange of the Netherlands, as I said, produced a democratic system. The idea that the government should not be ruled by the king, by the absolutist monarch, but should come from below. It should be a more democratic movement. Led by the House of Orange. This in England led to civil war between the king, King Charles I, who still believed in an absolutist form of government, who believed that he should rule England without the say of the people, without calling Parliament. And he tried to do so, and for 11 years he tried to rule as an absolutist monarch. He never called Parliament, and he survived on his lands, and he survived on import and export taxes, but he tried to ignore the 17th and 18th century demand of the middle class, what we would call the middle classes, for a say in government. And as a result of that, that led to a bloody civil war in England, leading to, for a period of time, between 1654 until 1658, England was actually a republic under Oliver Cromwell. Then, of course, it didn't work, so they brought back the king to be the King of England. But all of this was the fight between the people, the business people, the middle class people, to take power away from the aristocracy, from the king. This led to the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, and out of this came the Bill of Rights, John Locke, and the Bill of Rights, and from this Bill of Rights and the ideas of John Locke, the Declaration of Independence took chunks of his writings and put them in there. The result was this glorious revolution of 1688, which overthrew the king, and landowners took over the government. The bourgeoisie took over the government, if you like. And this began the era of history, if you like, which has dominated ever since, from 1688 up to the present, the era of what has been called gentlemanly capitalism. Gentlemanly capitalism. Gentlemanly capitalism. And our society, France, Britain, has been dominated by the capitalist, by the gentlemanly capitalist. These were not dukes, lords, royal figures. These were more upper middle class people. Majority of them were lawyers. Many of them became business people. But this is the class of people which has dominated the European Western civilization societies ever since.
So the middle class, huh?
Pardon?
So it was the middle class.
Upper middle class. Upper middle class. Most of them are lawyers, rich business people, bankers, insurers, shippers, and almost all of our presidents, for example, have either been military people, like Eisenhower or Washington or Ulysses Grant, or they've been lawyers. And the majority of them have been lawyers. And this is the class of gentlemanly capital. We've had a few business people, although we've never had a businessman like Trump. I mean, Trump would be from the class of gentlemanly capitalists, so he's not always very gentlemanly in his Twitter's comments, but nonetheless, he is from the gentlemanly class. Upper class, rich. He went to private schools, private universities, University of Pennsylvania. He is sending his kids, his son, Barron, $60,000 a year for high school. Those are the gentlemanly capitalist class. And that's the gentlemanly capitalist class that dominates Western civilization. All of our congressmen and senators are from this upper class of people, pretty much. They dominated society. So in other words, there was a feeling of a democratic movement, a scientific movement coming along. Some societies, however, are still very, very top-down, still dominated by powerful kings. But they could not resist the coming movements of science, the coming movements of democracy. And those people were called the enlightened despots, enlightened despots. They were still absolutist monarchs, like Louis XIV, but they accepted the Enlightenment ideas. They accepted democratic ideas, and they tried to modernize and to go with the times. Frederick the Great of Prussia, Catherine the Great of Russia, and also Peter the Great also was known. Chapter 26 talks the struggle to dominate the colonial world. And of course, the Europeans were in rivalry with each other. And when they were in rivalry with each other in Europe, they took that rivalry all over the world. And whenever the Europeans were fighting in Europe, if they had colonies, then they took the fight to the colonies as well. And the Europeans wanted to dominate the colonial world. They wanted to dominate it for their economic reasons. They wanted, the English, for example, wanted to dominate Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand, parts of Africa, India, which they had created a company in the year 1600, the East India Company, and they wanted to dominate all of these territories around the world so that they could sell to those countries and get raw materials in exchange. So there was a European war, or series of wars, that lasted several centuries, up until 100 years ago, to dominate the world. The big war for us, of course, was on the St. Lawrence and in the Ohio Valley as well, the Mississippi Valley, was with the French. In Canada was the Hudson's Bay Company. And the Hudson Bay Company goes all the way back to the 1660s and was given all of the land of Canada. What happened because of this European aggressiveness, because of this European capitalism, because of these gentlemanly capitalists, they looked around the world and looking for ways to make money. And they could make money, of course, through gold and silver, which is what drove the Spanish all the way down to Mexico and then into Bolivia and into Peru in the 1630s. It drove the Europeans to look elsewhere. And the Royal Society that I talked about collected money from volunteers and gave it to Captain Cook and gave it to Abel Tasman and gave it to other people and said, spend 2 or 3 years going around the world, mapping the world. Tell us what's out there. Tell us what opportunities are out there. Of course, the result was what we call globalization, the global economy. Global economy goes back many, many centuries, but there's a global economy of gold and silver, but most importantly, plantation agriculture. Plantation agriculture. In the 18th century, the Europeans became addicted to sugar, which they put in their tea and in their coffee and in their cakes and other kinds of things. But the European climate is too cold and too wet for sugar, so you use sugar plantations in the West Indies. And so they go out there for the sugar plantation. The Brazilians, of course, out into Brazil, and the Brazilians. The Portuguese out into Brazil. And then later on, the British were to march into India, and in part, of course, because they not only wanted sugar, they also wanted burlap, jute, burlap, and then they also wanted, of course, most importantly, they wanted wheat. And that drove the British into parts of India. And then it drove the British into parts of Egypt and in parts of Sudan to plant sugar and to plant cotton. And so and of course we know our own history in the South of plantation of cotton plantations, importing slaves into that. And it drove the Europeans all the way across to the Pacific, into small islands in the middle of the damn Pacific, Fiji, for example, where they shipped people the British shipped people from India into Fiji so that they could work on the plantations there. So the result was that globalization developed, and the whole world was brought into one vast capitalistic system. And as the French and the British and the Dutch mapped the whole world, and they drew maps of the whole world so they could find out where things are. They built lighthouses all over the globe, hundreds, thousands of lighthouses all over the world, so their ships could sail all over the world safely. And then later on, in the 19th century, they built telegraph cables under the whole world. The dot, 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 dash, dash, dash thing of sending signals all over the world. Took 2 minutes for a signal to come from London to then go a couple of hundred miles, and another guy received the signal and tapped it on to the next station, to the next station, to the next station, and it took 2 minutes for a signal to go from London all the way across to Australia. And then, of course, in the 1840s, they built the cable underground from Europe to North America, into Newfoundland, and then south into New England, to New York, and to us, linking the whole world up in this vast global economy, driven by the capitalists of London, of Amsterdam, Paris, and then after the Civil War, New York. And this global economy initially came about because of the plantation economy, because of plantation. But in the 19th century, of course, it was driven by banks, shipping companies, and insurance companies, and in the 20th century, of course, automobile companies and pharmaceutical companies. And the whole world, whether we like it or not, is one vast capitalist system, because initially it was the agriculture. The 7 Years' War was very, very important because essentially it destroyed French power in the world and made the British the dominant power in the world. In Quebec, it was James Wolfe who defeated the French and established British power in Canada. In India, in 1757, there was a British battle called the Battle of Plassey, in which Robert Clive won the battle and he is considered to be the founder of the British Empire in India. His nickname is Clive of India. Clive of India. And it was Quebec, Wolfe in Quebec, that enabled the British to dominate Canada, and Clive in India. 1783, the Treaty of Paris. The British lost their first British Empire. We all know our history of independence, Declaration of Independence, and the wars and the great victories. And that led in 1783 to the Treaty of Paris, the independence of the United States. The British promptly began building a second British Empire, or rather, the British, it was the gentlemanly capitalist in the City of London, the bankers, the shippers, the food importers and exporters who created this second British Empire, beginning in Canada. Then 5 years later, the first of the convicts were dropped off in Botany Bay in Australia, and Australia became a colony. Then about 60 years later, New Zealand became a colony. At the same time, the British were moving out into Asia, and then at the end of the 19th century, the British, the French, the Germans, the Italians took over the whole of the rest of Africa in what became known as the Scramble for Africa. In South America, of course, the great George Washington of South America is Simón Bolívar, the liberator. Simón Bolívar, the liberator, who liberated several countries of South America, and most famously, of course, Bolivia, after the country which is named after him. The French Revolution, 1789. You need to remember the name of Napoleon, of course, Napoleon Bonaparte, 1789, and the three estates. And the first estate was, of course, it was the church. The landowners and the church were the dominant groups of the French Parliament. But there were radicals, Democrats, if you like, the most famous of whom is Robespierre, Maximilien Robespierre. And he was the Democrat, and said Robespierre and many of the French Revolution people were inspired by 1776. This led to the age of Napoleon, who was, of course, initially from Corsica, the island of Corsica, which is half French and half Italian. Napoleon really spoke French with an Italian accent, and he was very, very dark. He did not look like a northern European Frenchman. He looked like a southern kind of guy, but he was in the army, and when he was sent to Italy, that is what made him famous. In the army of Italy, the conquering of Italy, spreading the French Revolution to Italy. It was in Italy that Napoleon made his fame and why he became a famous general. And as you know, famous generals then sometimes become presidents. In our case, George Washington. In our case, Ulysses S. Grant. And of course, World War II, General Eisenhower. And General Eisenhower became our president in 1952. So generals go on to be great leaders. In England, the Duke of Wellington, who defeated Napoleon in 1815, he became Prime Minister of Great Britain too. So Napoleon became famous because of the army of Italy, and then in the early 19th century, 1806, he made himself the Emperor of France, and of course, he like Alexander, he had a dream of conquering the world. And he sent his army to Egypt, where he wanted to control Egypt, and from Egypt the French wanted to march on to India and to take India away from the English, because they had lost it about 50 years earlier. This led to the Battle of the Nile. The Battle of the Nile in Egypt, and he lost his navy. What really threatened the capitalists, of course, was the continental system. The continental system. Napoleon wanted to make Europe a big market only for the French. Only for the French. Exclude Russian food, exclude English manufacturers, exclude English clothing, exclude English industrial goods which were developing at that time, and this continental system. This, of course, was a great economic threat to the British, to the Spanish, to the Portuguese, to the Russians, and to the Scandinavians, and it had to be defeated. One thing is to wage an ideological battle, the wage of ideas, but when you start attacking people's pocketbook and you take away their money, they get very, very angry. This is why we waged a vicious war after 1945 against the communism, because they were not capitalist, and that's why the Europeans waged this vicious war against Napoleon, because he was trying to take over the European market just for the French and exclude all other countries. And that was called the continental system. What defeated him, of course, was sea battles, essentially. The Battle of the Nile was the first great battle he lost. Then he lost the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, which is considered to be Britain's great victory, sea victory. And the ulcer. Napoleon said, after he was finally defeated in 1815, he said, the ulcer which destroyed me was the Spanish War. When I invaded Spain in the Peninsular War between 1807 and 1814, the Spanish responded with guerrilla warfare. The Spanish responded by burning down all of their fields where the food was being grown, so that the French soldiers, when they came in, they had no food, and they were fighting this guerrilla warfare. That's what Napoleon blamed all of his problems on, was the ulcer. That was Spain. That was the Peninsular War. Russia in 1812 didn't help either. Sent in 500,000 Frenchmen, 500,000 troops, not all Frenchmen. Many of them were mercenaries. And he finally was defeated, of course, in 1815 in Waterloo. He met his Waterloo. And of course, in the Irish Hills, we have the city, or the town, or the village of Napoleon. And then there's a state park, isn't there, Waterloo, just nearby. The 19th century, of course, fundamentally changed the world in which we live, beginning in the 18th century and in the 19th century. For thousands of years, we have all been farmers, and our economy has been an agricultural economy. But beginning in the 18th century, the world was fundamentally changed by industry. And people in their millions left the countryside, left the rural areas, moved into the towns, moved into the cities, and that changed thousands of years of our history, thousands of years of human existence. We've had two main developments in our human existence. The first was about 5,000 years ago. And 5,000 years ago, we developed cities. Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, in China, in India, in Mohenjo-daro, what is called the Indus civilization. It was the development of cities, the development of agriculture, the centralization the importance of kings. This, prior to that, we were all hunters and gatherers. But that was the civilization that was created about 5,000 years ago. That society exists. It was a rural society. It was an agricultural society. The economy was based upon the growing of food. Wealth came about for the growing of food up until the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution changed Western society fundamentally. We moved into the towns and into the cities. And of course, technological advances and entrepreneurship, capitalism, individual people getting money, and this is what drove the new global economy. Entrepreneurship, the invention of the steam engine, James Watt and the steam engine, which they put on wheels to make trains, which they put in ships to make steam ships, etc. They fundamentally changed the world. Factories began to develop, and as a result of factories developing and innovation, they were able to develop machine guns by the middle of the 19th century, machine guns which were used in the Civil War, and it changed life dramatically. The result was the creation of a new economic order in the world, what we call the world system. The world system. Global capitalism, the world system. And this world system consisted of certain countries which were considered the center, the center, of course, was Europe, later on North America, and all of the money was supposed to come to these areas. The role of Africa, the Middle East, India, China, South America, their role in the world system was to be the periphery, simply to grow the cotton, grow the food, ship it to North America, ship it to Europe, where then it would be made into clothing and into food, and then that cloth would then be shipped back to Africa or Egypt or other places around the world where it was grown. And of course, the center did not allow factories to be built in India or in Africa or in other places to compete with Europe. And that is why you find with capitalism, of course, is pretty much a zero-sum game. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. The gap between the rich and the poor gets bigger and bigger. And this is why, for example, some areas of the world are, in comparison, incredibly rich. Europe, North America, Canada, and some other countries. And other countries of the world are incredibly poor. And those poor countries those poor areas of the world have not been allowed to develop factories and be part of the global system. And of course, what the world system did was to create new classes of workers. New classes of workers. At the top, the people who were the factory managers, the people who were the accountants, the people who were the lawyers, the people who were the shippers, the people who were the bankers. These all became very, very rich. They became the bourgeoisie. And our Western society, since glorious revolution in 1600, has been dominated by the bourgeoisie, the upper middle classes. As I said, most of them are lawyers, many of them are businessmen, and underneath the bourgeoisie in the industrial factories were the ordinary workers. Those are called the proletariat. The proletariat. And at the very bottom of society, the people who had no skills, no education, who rely upon their muscles, who rely upon their sweat to try to earn a living. Those are known as lumpenproletariat, the people at the very, very bottom of the economic scale. And industrialization has made different workers at different economic levels. And it's an important part of society. Chapter 30 talked about the new ideologies that came about because of this new scientific development. Herbert Spencer, survival of the fittest, scientific racialism, and the idea that is sometimes called manifest destiny, sometimes it is called the white man's burden. We'll talk about this more after the break when we talk about imperialism. But the whites developed the idea that they had the white man's burden. It was the white man's burden to conquer the whole world, to bring Western civilization, to bring Christianity, to bring modernity, to bring science, to modernize the whole world, to bring Western ideas of democracy, Western ideas of justice, Western law, was the white man's burden. And as a result of that, of course, the Europeans devised this model of the world. The whites were at the top and the blacks were at the bottom of this society. This is known as scientific racialism, goes back to this survival of the fittest ideas. In democratic politics, of course, the great philosopher has been Edmund Burke, who talked about representative government and conservatism. Edmund Burke was an Irishman, but he was a Protestant. He was a member of the British Parliament who supported American independence because Americans, the Englishmen who were living in North America, the Americans had the rights of English law. And believed in representative government, and we elect people to be our representatives. They make the decision for us. This is the principle of representative government, the principle of conservatism. And he is the chief ideologue of this idea, Edmund Burke. Our House of Representatives and Senate is not a democratic movement like in ancient Greece, where the people have the vote. We elect a senator, we elect the House representative. The French in France, they represent somebody for the upper house. In Britain, the houses of parliament. And those people make decisions for us, representative government. So it makes it very conservative. The majority of the people who are elected into being our representatives are usually from the bourgeoisie. Almost all of them are lawyers, everywhere in Europe, for us too. And this is the system of government which we followed. John Locke, of course, was the father of liberalism. So do you believe that it is the lawyers, the businessmen, the rich businessmen like Trump, who should govern the country, or should it come from below? Should the government be in the interest of the majority of the people? If you say the majority of the people, then you are talking about liberalism and John Locke. And he is considered to be the father of liberalism, that argues that all opinion and all power should come from the bottom up, should come from the people. Not as Burke argued that it should come from the representatives in Parliament who represent us. Charles Fourier and Robert Owen were utopian socialists who there were some factory owners who were not simply interested in squeezing the workers as much as they could, putting young girls, for example, at the age of 4 down the coal mines so that they could sit by the door and open and close the door as the carts of coal went by. or hired young girls, especially young girls, because their fingers are very, very small, so that they can work on the copying machines. And they would work for almost nothing. 10, 12, sometimes 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. Brutal conditions in the 19th century, especially in Manchester in England, Birmingham in England, Lyon in France, Paris in France, Milan in Italy. And that there were some landowners who believed that they could create factories, humane factories, create a utopia. Utopia, of course, is a Greek word. It came up with Thomas More way back in 1516, and utopia means nowhere. Nowhere. So there is no utopia. There can be no utopia. But the utopian socialist tried to create ideal factories. Healthcare for the workers, schooling for the workers, housing for the workers, humane working conditions. And Fourier, the Frenchman, Robert Owen, the Scotsman. Marx, however, said, this is utopian. It will never ever work. Instead, all history is the history of class conflict. All history is the history of class conflict. Way back in the medieval period, there was a conflict between the barons against the king, which led to Magna Carta in 1215, in which the barons, the huge landowners, took power away from the king, and the barons then had the power. The French Revolution in 1789 was the next stage of the history of class conflict, because it was then the bourgeoisie took power away from the rich landowners in France. The next stage of history, the next stage of the historic revolution would be when the workers, the lumpen proletariat, and the proletariat rise up and overthrow the bourgeoisie. And finally, the majority of the people will have power. And this is history. All history is a history of class conflict. That's what Marx said. So he said that this utopian socialism is just pie in the sky. It will not work. The gentlemanly capitalists will never give up their money. They will never give up their power. They will never give up real wages to the working kind of people. The only thing you can do is revolution, overthrow people. Napoleon was defeated in 1815, so the big question was, what kind of system were they going to have? And of course, in Vienna was the Concert of Europe, the Congress of Vienna, dominated by Metternich from Austria. And he was a prince. He was not a royal figure, but prince was a title given to him. He was a politician, and he died in about 1848. So for 30 years, he dominated the politics of Europe. And he tried, and the Congress of Vienna has been considered a very, very successful peace conference because it kept the peace, more or less, up until 1914. The history of Europe has always been constant fighting, and that was to happen again, of course, in the 20th century, almost constant fighting. But the 19th century was an element of relatively peaceful relations between the great powers because of the Congress of Vienna and Metternich. The Bourbon was restored in France. In 1830, however, revolutions began once again. The French Revolution had spread ideas of the American Revolution. People were thinking increasingly of democracy, social democracy, power for the ordinary people, and this led to revolution 1830, in which it began in February in France, and then spread to Belgium, spread to Germany, spread to Austria, in which the people rose up again. They were crushed, of course, but 1830 was the year of revolutions. Great Britain was the only country to avoid revolutionary moment in 1830 because of the Great Reform Act of 1832, in which Manchester had been developing these filthy industrial cities. Birmingham had been developing, Leeds, up in the northwest above Liverpool, industrial areas had been receiving. These industrial towns with tens of thousands of people living in them had no votes. They had no representation in Parliament. And to give them the votes, to give the proletariat the vote, came the Great Reform Act. So the British compromised. And as a result of compromising and of giving the workers some representation, then they were able to avoid the revolution in 1830 and in 1848. And again, 48 was the February Revolution in France. And again, in 1830, 1848, workers rose up in rebellion against the government, inspired by 1789, inspired by the French Revolution, trying to take over power. Both times they were crushed by the government. In Italy, Mazzini led the Young Italy group in 1830 to try to create freedom and a new Italy. As a result of 1848, comes to power Napoleon III. Napoleon III started out as an elected president, then he made himself the Emperor of France, and it was he who was responsible for the rebuilding of Paris, making Paris perhaps arguably the most beautiful city in the world today. And that's due to Napoleon III. Italy was created in 1871 as a result of Count Cavour and Sardinia, but the greatest figure of the 19th century Europe after Metternich in the early part of the century, the latter part of the century, is Bismarck, Otto von Bismarck. He was the one responsible for uniting Germany. He was the one in a period of 6 wars, fighting 3 wars against the Danish in 1864, and then the second one against Austria in 1866, and finally in 1870 against France. And they won all 3 battles, dominated Europe, and the result was the creation of Germany in 1871 after the Franco-Prussian War. You need to remember the name of Bismarck. The so-called sick man of Europe was the Ottoman Empire, the collapsing of the Ottoman Empire, which was, and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire was in many senses responsible for the creation of the start of World War I in 1914. So there are about 54 topics. There will be 50. You are looking at the answers. So if you haven't memorized all of these names, please memorize them before Wednesday. Any questions?
Do they name Bismarck after him?
Bismarck, yes. Yes. Bismarck.